The midnight sky stretched vast and unbroken, with the plane gliding smoothly through the darkness, its engines humming softly in the otherwise silent cabin. Inside, dimmed lights cast a gentle glow over sleeping and restless passengers alike. This was a long-haul overnight flight, and most of the passengers were either dozing off or reading quietly, trying to pass the hours until dawn. Among them, sitting in a quiet corner of the business class section, was Jamal Carter, a man who appeared by all outward signs as just another weary traveler. He wore simple attire, a casual jacket, a well-worn button-down shirt and comfortable slacks. His outfit was carefully chosen to blend in, to avoid attracting attention, which was precisely his goal. But Jamal Carter was far from ordinary. In fact, he was the owner of the very airline on which he was now traveling, an empire he had built from the ground up through years of hard work, grit, and resilience. Despite his success, Jamal had never forgotten the struggles he endured along the way. As a black man in a predominantly white industry, he had faced discrimination and bias at nearly every step. He knew the sting of being judged solely by the color of his skin rather than his abilities. Tonight, as he sat quietly in his seat, those memories played faintly in the back of his mind, adding weight to his purpose for this journey. Jamal had a unique way of running his business. Rather than relying on reports and second-hand accounts, he preferred to experience his airline services firsthand. He often traveled incognito, booking seats at random and observing the operations as any other passenger would. It was his way of staying connected with the reality of his business, ensuring that his airline maintained the values he had built it upon: respect, inclusivity, and excellent service for all. But tonight's journey, he sensed, was going to be different. He couldn't shake a lingering feeling, a subtle tension in the air that seemed to whisper of things to come. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant named Emily Patterson caught sight of Jamal. She had worked with the airline for several years and had developed a reputation among her colleagues as someone who could be a little prickly. Emily prided herself on being efficient, but her efficiency often came at the expense of patience and kindness, especially toward passengers who didn't quite fit her expectations. Although she would never openly admit it, Emily carried a host of biases that colored her interactions, particularly with passengers she perceived as different or undeserving of the privileges afforded by first or business class. When she saw Jamal in his understated attire, her mind immediately categorized him as an outsider, someone who likely didn't belong. As she made her way through the cabin, attending to other passengers, Emily's gaze lingered on Jamal a little too long, her expression betraying her subtle judgment. He noticed her glances but kept his face neutral, observing her behavior without reacting. It wasn't the first time he had felt this type of scrutiny, and he knew that responding in any obvious way could escalate things needlessly. Instead, he let her assumptions hang in the air, content to let her show her true colors. Jamal's calm, watchful demeanor only served to irritate Emily, who took his quiet confidence as a challenge to her authority. After the initial beverage service, Jamal politely raised his hand to request a cup of water. Emily, busy chatting with another passenger, saw his gesture but chose to ignore it, pretending not to notice. Jamal patiently waited, his hand still raised, hoping she might return his way. Several minutes passed before she finally walked over, her demeanor exuding annoyance as she came to a halt beside his seat. "Yes?" she asked curtly, barely looking at him. Jamal maintained his calm, polite tone. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Emily hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We're currently busy with other passengers, sir. I'll get to you when I have time." Jamal nodded slightly, accepting her answer without protest, though he noticed that she delivered water to another passenger only moments later. He watched her interactions closely, noting how her attitude shifted when she addressed others in the cabin, particularly those who fit a more conventional profile of business-class travelers. She was cheerful, attentive, even flirtatious with certain passengers, but whenever her gaze drifted back to him, it hardened, carrying a faint but unmistakable trace of disdain. The subtle tension between them lingered, unspoken yet palpable. Other passengers began to sense something as well, exchanging quiet glances as they noticed Emily's selective approach to service. Jamal could feel the unspoken judgments hanging in the air, but he kept his focus steady, silently cataloguing every detail of her behavior. As the flight continued, Emily's treatment of Jamal grew colder. Every time he made a simple request, she delayed or ignored it, prioritizing other passengers over him. Her disdain became less subtle, a barely concealed contempt that pulsed beneath her forced smile. Jamal sensed that she was testing him, pushing the boundaries to see if he would react, perhaps even hoping to provoke him into an outburst that she could use as justification for her attitude. But Jamal refused to give her that satisfaction. He knew the game she was playing, and he had no intention of letting her win. What Emily didn't realize, however, was that Jamal had a purpose far beyond personal satisfaction. Every interaction he had with her, every slight she cast his way, was noted mentally, recorded in his mind as part of an ongoing assessment. To her, he was just another nameless, faceless passenger who wouldn't leave a mark on her life beyond this flight. But to him, she was rapidly becoming a glaring example of the exact behavior he was determined to root out of his company. As the cabin dimmed for the night, and passengers around him began to settle in for sleep, Jamal's mind remained active, replaying the evening's events and considering his options. He wondered if confronting her directly would be more impactful, or if allowing the situation to play out naturally would reveal even deeper biases. He had seen this type of behavior before, but rarely this openly on his own airline, and it filled him with a quiet determination to address the systemic issues that allowed people like Emily to remain unchecked in positions of service. As the hours stretched on, Jamal found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He had worked tirelessly to create an airline that represented more than just luxury. It represented respect and dignity for every traveler, regardless of their background. He had encountered countless challenges, faced discrimination, and overcome obstacles that few people around him understood. Sitting here, once again subjected to the subtle prejudice that had shadowed him for much of his life, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a single flight or a single employee. This was about creating an environment where no passenger ever felt the way he was feeling right now. In the dim light of the cabin, Jamal's face remained calm, but his eyes burned with quiet resolve. He knew that this journey, uncomfortable as it might be, was exactly what he needed to push for the changes his company deserved. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm. Lights were dimmed, and most passengers had reclined their seats, drifting off into sleep or idly flipping through in-flight entertainment. Jamal, however, remained alert. He was well aware that his unobtrusive presence in business class had already sparked something in Emily. Her sidelong glances, her dismissive tone, these small acts had not gone unnoticed by him. Jamal had faced prejudice before, and he recognized it easily, but he had not expected to encounter it here, on his own airline, where he had worked tirelessly to foster an atmosphere of respect and equality. Jamal pressed the call button above his seat, hoping to address a small request. After a few minutes, Emily appeared, her face painted with a look of mild irritation. She approached him with a forced, tight-lipped smile, one that conveyed neither warmth nor professionalism. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped. Jamal maintained his calm, polite demeanor. "Could I have a glass of coffee, please? Just something to help me stay awake a little longer." Emily sighed, as if he had asked her for the world. She rolled her eyes subtly, but not so subtly that he would miss it. "Coffee, right? We'll see if we have time to get that for you, sir. We have a lot of passengers to tend to," she replied, barely masking her annoyance. Jamal nodded and thanked her, watching as she turned away and continued down the aisle, still clearly unbothered by her attitude. Moments later, she brought coffee to a passenger seated just a few rows ahead of him, who had requested the same thing. She handed it to him with a warm smile and a friendly exchange of words, a display of courtesy she had notably withheld from Jamal. As he waited patiently, Jamal noticed a few other passengers observing Emily's behavior. One elderly woman seated across from him gave him a sympathetic nod, as if recognizing the discrimination playing out in front of her. Jamal acknowledged her with a faint smile, then returned his gaze to the aisle, wondering how long Emily would continue this game. Eventually, Emily returned, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. This time, her movements were deliberate, her posture rigid as she approached his seat. But as she neared, she accidentally tripped, tilting the cup just enough that the hot coffee spilled directly onto Jamal's hand and lap. The hot liquid burned as it soaked through his clothes, and he instinctively flinched, his breath catching from the unexpected pain. "Oh!" Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in exaggerated shock. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm that only he could detect. "I must have tripped. It happens sometimes." Jamal took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on him, watching to see how he would react. Every fiber of his being urged him to respond, to call her out for her careless and clearly intentional behavior. But he knew that any outburst could play right into her hands, giving her exactly the excuse she needed to paint him as the aggressive passenger she clearly wanted to see. "It's all right," he said quietly, his voice measured. "Could you bring me some napkins, please?" Emily's face twitched with barely concealed irritation at his calmness. Perhaps she had expected him to react more strongly, to get angry or make a scene, but instead, Jamal's steady composure only seemed to unsettle her further. She turned without a word and returned moments later with a few napkins, tossing them onto his tray table with a hasty, dismissive motion. Jamal thanked her without looking up, dabbing his soaked hands and lap, quietly enduring the stinging pain. The coffee had left a dark stain on his clothes, but his expression remained neutral, betraying no trace of the discomfort he felt. Inside, however, he was taking careful mental notes, cataloguing each slight, each insult, each attempt to provoke him. This was no longer just about her behavior. This was about something larger, something that had to be addressed within his company. As Emily moved away, Jamal caught a glimpse of her whispering to another flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, who had only recently joined the airline. He could see Emily casting glances in his direction as she spoke in hushed tones, and Sarah's face shifted from surprise to unease as she glanced his way. Whatever Emily had told her, it seemed to be aimed at reinforcing her own biased perception of him. Jamal sighed quietly, wondering how far Emily was willing to go. He understood the power of subtle manipulation, of the way rumors and insinuations could shape perceptions. He had encountered it all before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, even in social gatherings. But this was different. This was happening under his roof, in his airline, and it was a stark reminder of the very biases he had worked so hard to fight against. Not long after, a soft voice startled him. It was Sarah, the young flight attendant Emily had been speaking to. She approached him with a tentative smile, looking somewhat apologetic. "Sir, I noticed the spill," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Would you like me to bring you a fresh coffee or perhaps help you clean up?" Jamal glanced at her, noting the sincerity in her eyes. He could tell that Sarah was uncomfortable, caught between the seniority of her colleague and her own sense of professionalism. He offered her a gentle smile, appreciating her attempt at kindness. "Thank you, Sarah," he replied softly. "That would be very kind of you." She nodded and quickly disappeared to prepare a fresh cup. As he waited, Jamal's mind turned, analyzing each interaction, each reaction. He could feel the narrative Emily was trying to construct around him, but he also sensed that she was losing control of it. Her own behavior was becoming a liability, one that even her colleagues were beginning to notice. And if there was one thing Jamal had learned over the years, it was that truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how much someone tried to manipulate the narrative. When Sarah returned with the coffee, she offered it to him with a gentle smile, adding a small apology on behalf of the team. Jamal nodded, grateful for her professionalism, and took a careful sip, savoring the warmth that contrasted sharply with the earlier experience. This moment, though small, reinforced his belief that change was possible, that there were people within his company who cared, who understood the importance of respect. But as Sarah walked away, Emily returned, her expression hard and unyielding. She glanced at the coffee in his hand and sneered just slightly, a look that seemed almost mocking. "Everything all right now, sir?" she asked, the faintest edge of hostility lacing her words. Jamal met her gaze, his expression calm, but his eyes steely. "Yes, thank you, Emily," he replied, letting her name linger just a moment longer than necessary. His tone was calm, but there was a weight to it, a subtle reminder that he was not just another nameless passenger. He could see her posture stiffen, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face as she registered the hint of authority in his voice. For the first time, Jamal saw a trace of doubt in Emily's eyes, a brief hesitation that revealed her awareness of the line she was treading. But her pride and resentment overpowered her caution, and she quickly masked her uncertainty with a tight, forced smile. "Glad to hear it," she replied tersely, before pivoting sharply and disappearing down the aisle. Jamal watched her retreating figure, his mind now set. This wasn't just about a cup of spilled coffee or an attitude problem. This was a test of the values he had instilled in his company, a challenge to the very principles that had guided him through every decision, every hire, every policy. And he knew, with unwavering certainty, that this test was one he could not afford to ignore. As the plane flew onward through the night, Jamal leaned back, his gaze focused on the dimly lit cabin around him. The quiet strength in his eyes spoke of a man who had endured worse and emerged stronger, and he knew that by the end of this journey, he would bring this incident to light, not just as a matter of personal pride, but as a statement of the unyielding standards he expected from those representing his name. This was no longer just a journey home. It was the beginning of something much larger. The cabin had become quieter as the flight progressed, with most passengers settling into a comfortable, sleepy lull. Jamal remained in his seat, seemingly calm, though the subtle hostility he had experienced from Emily simmered just beneath his composed exterior. The incident with the coffee had left him damp and uncomfortable, but it was the dismissive contempt in Emily's eyes that lingered in his mind, more than the physical discomfort. As he sat, reflecting on what had just occurred, he noticed Emily once again, making her way down the aisle. Her demeanor had changed slightly, her movements sharper, almost agitated, as if the events of the evening were beginning to weigh on her. It seemed that Jamal's calm resilience had unnerved her, stirring up an antagonism she could barely contain. When she reached his row, Emily stopped suddenly, meeting his eyes with a hardened gaze that hinted at something deeper, a resentment she couldn't fully hide. It was as if his refusal to react had challenged her in some unspoken way, exposing her pettiness and making her feel small. Without looking directly at him, she addressed him in a clipped tone. "Sir, if you need anything further, you can use the call button," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled irritation. "We're quite busy up here, and we can't attend to every single minor request at a moment's notice." Jamal sensed the dig in her words, her attempt to diminish him, to remind him of his place, or rather, where she thought his place should be. He maintained his composure, choosing his words carefully, understanding that any show of frustration might be exactly what she wanted. "Thank you, Emily. I'll be sure to do that if I need anything," he replied, his tone calm, but with an edge that subtly asserted his dignity. Her gaze flickered, a slight shift betraying her frustration that he hadn't taken the bait. She had wanted him to respond emotionally, to give her a reason to label him as difficult or disruptive. Instead, his calm only highlighted the pettiness of her actions, and she found herself cornered in a battle of her own making. Just as she turned to walk away, a passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with a kind expression and watchful eyes, raised her voice in a gentle but firm tone. "Excuse me, miss. I couldn't help but notice the way you've been speaking to this gentleman," she said, addressing Emily directly. Her voice carried a quiet authority, and several passengers turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. Emily froze, caught off guard by the unexpected intervention. Her expression faltered for a split second before she plastered on a polite smile, her voice dripping with forced cheerfulness. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there something I can help you with?" The woman glanced at Jamal, then back at Emily, her gaze unwavering. "Actually, yes. I'd appreciate it if you could extend the same courtesy to all of your passengers, regardless of who they are." A tense silence settled over the immediate area. Emily's forced smile wavered, and a hint of color rose to her cheeks. She glanced around, noticing the curious stares of other passengers who had picked up on the tension and were watching the interaction closely. Her grip on her service tray tightened, and Jamal could see the subtle twitch in her jaw as she fought to keep her composure. "Of course, ma'am," Emily replied, her voice strained. "We do our best to provide excellent service to all of our passengers." Jamal felt a surge of quiet gratitude toward the woman for her intervention, though he remained silent, letting the scene unfold without adding fuel to the fire. He knew that any reaction from him would only complicate matters further, and he didn't want to stoop to Emily's level of petty conflict. Emily turned away, her movements stiff and mechanical, clearly rattled by the unexpected confrontation. She shot one last glare at Jamal, as if blaming him for the embarrassing situation. Then, with a forced calmness, she disappeared toward the back of the plane, leaving a wake of tension behind her. As soon as she was out of earshot, the woman across the aisle leaned slightly toward Jamal, offering him a kind, knowing smile. "Some people just can't handle seeing others treated with dignity, can they?" she said quietly. Jamal returned her smile, grateful for her empathy. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The woman nodded, her gaze warm and steady. "I've seen enough of this kind of behavior in my lifetime. I wasn't about to let it slide." Jamal nodded, deeply moved by her words. Her support reminded him of the importance of allyship, of the strength that could come from small acts of solidarity. But he also knew that this small victory would likely come with consequences, especially given Emily's temperament. Sure enough, it wasn't long before Emily returned, this time with an air of barely concealed hostility. She approached Jamal's seat once again, her expression hard and unyielding. There was a glint in her eyes, a look that spoke of someone who had decided to double down, to make a point that she wasn't going to be undermined. "Sir," she began, her tone icy, "I'll need you to move to another seat. We've received complaints from other passengers about the disturbance in this area." Jamal looked at her, realizing immediately that this was a tactic, a way for her to regain control of the situation by isolating him, making him feel like he was the problem. It was a calculated move, and he could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she awaited his response, hoping he would resist so she could escalate further. "Complaints?" he asked, his voice steady and measured. "I wasn't aware that I had caused any disturbance." Emily's lips curved into a cold smile. "It's not up for discussion, sir. I'll need you to follow me to a different seat." Jamal held her gaze, sensing that any refusal would only play into her narrative. He took a deep breath, weighing his options, then decided that he would follow her lead, for now. He knew that confronting her directly in this moment wouldn't accomplish anything. Instead, he would let her actions speak for themselves, exposing her intentions for all to see. "Very well," he said calmly, standing up and gathering his belongings. "Lead the way!" Emily turned and walked briskly toward the rear of the plane, leading him through the cabin with a determined stride. As they passed rows of passengers, he could feel the curious stares and murmurs following them, a mix of sympathy and confusion evident on the faces of those who had witnessed the earlier interactions. When they reached the rear section, Emily pointed to a cramped seat near the back, far from the comforts of business class. It was an obvious demotion, one that she intended to humiliate him with, to remind him of his supposed place. "This will be your seat for the remainder of the flight," she said with a tight smile. "I trust you'll be more comfortable here." Jamal looked at the seat, then back at Emily, his face unreadable. He could sense the triumph in her eyes, the satisfaction she derived from exerting her authority, but he also knew that her actions were sowing seeds of doubt among the other passengers, many of whom had noticed the discrepancies in her treatment of him. Without a word, Jamal settled into the seat, his calm demeanor unshaken. He was well aware of the discomfort of his new position, but he had endured far worse in his life, and he refused to let her small-mindedness define his experience. A few minutes later, Sarah, the young flight attendant who had previously shown him kindness, appeared by his side, her expression filled with genuine concern. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience," she whispered, glancing nervously at Emily's direction. "If there's anything I can do to make you more comfortable, please let me know." Jamal smiled at her, grateful for her sincerity. "Thank you, Sarah. You've been very professional. I appreciate it." Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation. She lowered her voice even further, casting a quick glance toward Emily to ensure she wasn't being overheard. I just want you to know that not everyone on this crew agrees with what's happening," she said softly. "If you need any assistance, please don't hesitate to ask." Jamal nodded, touched by her words. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be fine." She nodded, visibly relieved, and retreated back to her station, leaving him alone in his new seat. The moments that followed were filled with a tense silence, punctuated only by the occasional glance from nearby passengers who had observed the unfolding drama with a mixture of sympathy and outrage. Jamal sat back, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle the situation once the flight landed. He knew he had options, powerful ones that would allow him to address the behavior he had witnessed, but he also understood the importance of patience, of letting the situation play out naturally. He wanted to see how far Emily would go, how deeply rooted her biases truly were. As the plane continued its journey through the night, Jamal's resolve only strengthened. He was more than ready to confront the issues that had been laid bare, to hold those responsible accountable. This was no longer just a test of his patience. It was a test of the very values that his airline stood for. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of quiet reflection. The path that had brought him here was paved with challenges, with moments of quiet resilience in the face of prejudice. He had spent his life fighting for respect, for the right to be seen for who he was, rather than the assumptions others made about him. And now, as he sat in the cramped seat in the back of his own airline, he knew that this fight was far from over. In his heart, he knew that this incident would become a defining moment, not just for him, but for the company he had built, the employees who looked to him for guidance, and the passengers who trusted him to ensure their dignity and respect. As he drifted into a light doze, one thought lingered in his mind, clear and resolute. Justice would be served, and the truth would come to light, no matter the cost. As the hours stretched on, Jamal remained in his new seat at the back of the plane, the low hum of the engines filling the cabin with a muted, persistent noise. His calm demeanor belied the turmoil of thoughts running through his mind. Every insult, every dismissive glance, and every attempt by Emily to demean him had left a mark, yet he maintained his composure. To the outside world, he was just another passenger enduring an uncomfortable flight. But within himself, Jamal was quietly planning, preparing for the reckoning he knew was necessary. The air around him was thick with tension. Several passengers who had observed the earlier interactions occasionally glanced his way, some with sympathy, others with disapproval directed at Emily's behavior. Jamal could see the collective discomfort growing, a quiet murmur of unease that Emily seemed oblivious to. She moved through the aisles, ignoring him completely, as if his presence was an irritant she could simply brush away. But Jamal wasn't about to be dismissed so easily. He had already made mental notes of every detail, cataloguing each moment as evidence. His approach was methodical, shaped by years of navigating hostile boardrooms and negotiating deals with people who often underestimated him. Emily might have the temporary upper hand, but Jamal was prepared to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. Halfway through the flight, Sarah, the young and kind-hearted flight attendant, returned to his seat. She knelt down slightly so that her voice wouldn't carry, her expression earnest and apologetic. "Sir, I just wanted to check in on you. I know this has been difficult," she whispered, choosing her words carefully. Jamal nodded appreciatively, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. He could tell that Sarah felt conflicted, caught between her loyalty to the crew and her sense of justice. She didn't have the authority to intervene directly, but her compassion was evident, and he valued her support. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate you coming to check on me," he replied, his voice low and warm. "It's clear you care about your passengers, and that means a lot." Sarah hesitated, looking down before speaking again. "I've seen how she's treating you. It's not right, and I want you to know that this doesn't reflect the values of our airline, or at least not the values that most of us believe in." Jamal's eyes softened as he absorbed her words. Here was a young woman who, despite her position, had the courage to speak up, to express her discomfort with the behavior of a more senior colleague. Her words reaffirmed his commitment to ensuring that the airline truly lived up to its ideals. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Your honesty and kindness will not go unnoticed. I promise you that." She gave him a small, relieved smile, but before she could say more, Emily appeared at the front of the aisle, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of Sarah speaking with Jamal. Her mouth twisted in irritation, and she approached with quick, decisive steps, her face a mask of forced politeness. "Sarah," Emily said, her voice clipped, "we have other passengers who need attending. Please make yourself useful." Sarah straightened, her expression shifting back to a neutral professionalism. "Yes, of course," she replied, casting a quick, apologetic glance at Jamal before hurrying away. As Emily turned her gaze to Jamal, her eyes held a flicker of smug satisfaction. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering, though her words were filled with icy condescension. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, a sarcastic edge to her tone. "It seems like you've been needing quite a bit of attention tonight." Jamal looked up at her, his expression unflinching. There was a quiet strength in his gaze, an unspoken challenge that made her shift uncomfortably. He could tell that she was beginning to realize she might have underestimated him, that his calm was not a sign of weakness, but of restraint. Still, her pride and resentment wouldn't allow her to back down. "Thank you for checking, Emily," he replied evenly. "I'm quite all right." She raised an eyebrow, her smile thin and brittle. "Good. I wouldn't want you to feel neglected. We strive for the highest standards of service after all." Jamal allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "I'm sure you do." Emily's face hardened, but she said nothing more, retreating back up the aisle, her shoulders stiff with frustration. Jamal watched her go, knowing that her own actions were exposing her far more effectively than anything he could say. Her condescension, her blatant disregard for professionalism, it was all on full display, visible to the passengers and crew alike. The flight continued in tense silence, punctuated by the occasional glance from curious or sympathetic passengers. Jamal could sense the growing discomfort around him, the quiet awareness spreading through the cabin. People were noticing, and even those who had initially kept to themselves were beginning to feel the weight of Emily's behavior. As the hours wore on, Jamal took out his notebook and began writing, his pen moving swiftly across the page. He wasn't just documenting the events of the evening. He was drafting a plan, a vision for the changes he knew needed to be implemented within his company. This incident had illuminated flaws not just in one individual, but in the training, culture, and accountability systems that allowed someone like Emily to feel emboldened in her bias. At that moment, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting him slightly. The lights flickered, and a nervous murmur ran through the cabin. Jamal put his notebook away, glancing around to reassure himself that everything was under control. But even as the turbulence subsided, he noticed a new tension in the air, a palpable sense of unease that went beyond the bumps in the flight. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice came through, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a bit of unexpected turbulence, but I want to assure you that everything is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and our flight attendants will be around to assist you if needed." The announcement seemed to calm most of the passengers, but Jamal noticed that Emily was lingering near the front of the cabin, her posture tense, as if she were waiting for something. Her eyes darted toward him once more, a flicker of something darker in her gaze. A thought crossed Jamal's mind, a realization that perhaps Emily wasn't just intent on demeaning him, but on escalating the situation further. He understood people like her, those who thrived on control, who found satisfaction in asserting dominance over others. And now he suspected she might be plotting something more extreme, an attempt to humiliate him in a way that went beyond subtle slights. Minutes later, Emily approached his row again, this time holding a small clipboard. Her expression was inscrutable, but there was a glint in her eyes, a barely concealed triumph. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you a few questions," she said in a voice that carried just a bit louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Jamal raised an eyebrow, keeping his voice calm. "Questions?" "Yes," she replied, her tone brisk and official. "We've received reports of suspicious behavior, and I need to verify a few things. It's standard procedure, I assure you." The passengers around them exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. Jamal could feel the weight of their gaze, the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Emily was trying to publicly embarrass him, to make him appear as a disruptive presence that required special scrutiny. But instead of reacting defensively, he simply met her gaze, allowing her to proceed. "Please go ahead," he said, his voice steady. Emily faltered for a moment, surprised by his lack of resistance. She had expected him to push back, to protest, but his composure threw her off balance. Nevertheless, she pressed on, determined to assert her authority. "May I ask where you're traveling from, and your purpose for being on this flight?" she asked, her voice taking on a falsely polite tone. Jamal's eyes met hers, his gaze unwavering. He knew exactly what she was doing, and he wasn't about to let her intimidate him. "I'm traveling for business," he replied, keeping his answer deliberately vague. "And what kind of business, if I may ask?" she pressed, her tone sharpening. He paused for a brief moment, just enough to let the silence linger, creating a tension that seemed to unsettle her. Then, with a slight smile, he answered, "Aviation." Emily blinked, her expression shifting slightly as she processed his answer. It was the truth, but the way he had phrased it seemed to unsettle her, as if she sensed there was something more to his presence on this flight that she hadn't anticipated. Before she could respond, the middle-aged woman who had previously defended Jamal leaned forward from across the aisle, her voice carrying a firm authority that silenced the surrounding whispers. "Excuse me, miss," she said, addressing Emily directly. "This gentleman has done nothing to warrant such questioning. We all witnessed the way you've treated him, and I think it's time you stop this charade." The firmness in her voice left Emily momentarily speechless. Her face flushed, and she glanced around, realizing that the tide was turning against her. The other passengers nodded in agreement, their silent solidarity a clear statement of their disapproval. Jamal watched Emily's reaction, noting the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. For the first time, her control over the situation was slipping, and she seemed to realize that her behavior had not gone unnoticed. She stammered, attempting to regain her composure, but the disapproval of the passengers had created a rift that she could no longer ignore. Without another word, she turned on her heel and retreated down the aisle, her posture rigid with embarrassment. Jamal exhaled quietly, feeling a wave of satisfaction at the turn of events. He hadn't had to raise his voice or make a scene. The truth of her behavior had spoken for itself, exposing her bias in a way that could not be ignored. As he settled back into his seat, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a validation of his values, a reminder of why he had worked so hard to build a company founded on respect and integrity. In that moment, he knew that when this flight landed, there would be changes. Emily's actions had sparked something he couldn't ignore, a call to action that would shape the future of his airline. The passengers around him offered nods of support, a quiet affirmation that they too had seen the truth. Jamal met their gazes, grateful for their silent solidarity, and prepared himself for the reckoning that awaited upon landing. This was only the beginning. The cabin remained thick with tension as the flight continued, each minute seeming to stretch longer than the last. Jamal sat quietly, a calm but resolved look in his eyes, still seated in the cramped economy seat where Emily had relegated him. He hadn't expected her behavior to escalate to this level, but now that it had, he was prepared for whatever came next. He had endured her calculated slights, her attempts to humiliate him, and even her public interrogation, all with a quiet strength that only seemed to unsettle her more. Meanwhile, Emily paced the aisle with a visible restlessness. Her previous attempts to undermine him had not gone as planned, and she could sense the growing discomfort from the other passengers. Yet instead of backing down, she appeared emboldened, as if driven by some stubborn need to regain control over the situation. She cast occasional glances at Jamal, her eyes narrowing each time she saw his unshaken composure, as though his calmness was a personal affront. It wasn't long before her frustration finally found a new outlet. Emily approached one of her colleagues, another senior flight attendant named Mark, and leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones that carried a hint of urgency. Jamal watched as Mark's face shifted from polite attentiveness to surprise, then a tense expression of worry. Whatever Emily had told him, it seemed to unsettle him, and Jamal could only guess what story she was spinning now. After a few moments, Mark reluctantly approached Jamal's seat, his expression tinged with hesitation. He seemed apologetic but determined, clearly feeling obligated to carry out whatever Emily had set in motion. Jamal met Mark's gaze calmly, understanding that the man was likely just following orders. "Sir," Mark began, his voice low but tense, "I'm afraid we need to speak with you privately in the galley. If you could please follow me." Jamal glanced briefly at the other passengers, who were now openly watching the interaction, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. He could feel their silent support, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had witnessed Emily's behavior and understood the context of what was unfolding. He nodded to Mark and rose from his seat, calmly following him toward the galley at the back of the plane. As they reached the small, confined space, Mark turned to face him, his expression conflicted. He looked as though he wanted to say something, perhaps even apologize, but he held back, likely constrained by protocol in the presence of Emily, who had followed them and now stood just a few feet away, her arms crossed and her gaze cold. "Sir," Mark began hesitantly, glancing at Emily before continuing, "we've received concerns regarding your behavior on this flight. Specifically, there's been a report that you've been acting in a manner that some passengers find disruptive and suspicious." Jamal raised an eyebrow, allowing a brief silence to fill the air before he responded. "Disruptive and suspicious?" he echoed, his tone calm but firm. "I would be very interested to know what specific behavior led to these concerns." Mark shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught in an awkward position. Well, we've had reports of excessive requests, and there's a concern that you may have been causing a disturbance." Emily's eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction, her arms crossed as she watched the exchange unfold. It was clear she felt she had finally regained control, that her narrative was taking shape, and that Jamal would be cornered by her fabricated accusations. Jamal, however, remained unfazed. He could see through her tactics and understood that any reaction would only fuel her claims. He looked directly at Mark, his calm expression unwavering. "I see," he said evenly. "And do you personally have any reason to believe that I've behaved inappropriately?" Mark hesitated, glancing nervously at Emily. It was clear he didn't want to escalate the situation, but he was trapped by the constraints of his role and the authority that Emily wielded over him. I have not observed anything myself, sir," he admitted reluctantly. "But in cases like this, we are required to take all concerns seriously." Jamal nodded, acknowledging the position Mark was in. "I understand. Thank you for your honesty." Emily's face tightened, clearly irritated by Jamal's refusal to engage in any outburst or confrontation. Her gaze hardened, and she took a step closer, her voice filled with barely concealed contempt. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been taking notes during this flight," she said, her tone accusatory. It's rather unusual behavior for a passenger, wouldn't you agree? Jamal met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. He understood that this was her last attempt to paint him as a suspicious figure, someone who didn't belong in her neatly defined idea of who should be allowed in business class. But he was done allowing her the upper hand. He had endured enough of her disrespect, and it was time to assert his authority. Emily, he began, his voice steady and composed. I have been documenting my experience on this flight, as I often do when I travel on my own airline. The color drained from Emily's face, her eyes widening in shock. The realization hit her like a jolt, and for a moment she appeared utterly speechless. Mark's eyes also widened as he processed Jamal's words, a dawning recognition in his expression. You're… Emily stammered, her voice faltering. Yes, Jamal confirmed, his gaze never leaving hers. I am the owner of this airline, and I believe I now have a clear understanding of how some members of my staff treat passengers whom they deem unworthy of respect. Emily's face went pale, her composure crumbling as the weight of her actions settled over her. The mask of authority she had worn so confidently throughout the flight shattered, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. The realization of what she had done, of who she had humiliated and demeaned, hit her with the force of a tidal wave. Mark took a step back, his face a mixture of shock and discomfort. He glanced nervously between Jamal and Emily, clearly unsure of what to do or say. Jamal could see the turmoil in his expression, the conflict between his loyalty to his colleague and his newfound awareness of the severity of the situation. Mr. Carter, I had no idea, Mark stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamal held up a hand, stopping him. It's all right, Mark. You've conducted yourself professionally. I have no grievances with you. Relief flooded Mark's face, though his expression remained tense. He nodded respectfully, stepping aside to give Jamal and Emily the space they needed for what was clearly an inevitable confrontation. Emily, however, was still rooted to the spot, her face frozen in a mixture of shock and horror. Her carefully constructed narrative had unraveled before her eyes, and she seemed unable to process the reality of what she had done. Jamal looked at her, his expression one of disappointment rather than anger. I built this airline on the principles of respect and dignity, he said, his voice calm but laced with quiet authority. My goal has always been to create an environment where every passenger feels valued, regardless of their background, appearance, or personal circumstances. Your behavior on this flight has not only violated those principles, but has also exposed a serious problem within our organization. Emily's face flushed, her eyes darting around as though seeking an escape. But there was none. She was trapped, not only by her own actions, but by the realization that every passenger, every crew member, and now her employer had seen the truth of her prejudice. I didn't know, she began, her voice trembling. Didn't know what? Jamal interrupted, his tone still composed but now carrying an edge. Didn't know that I owned this airline? Or didn't know that your behavior was unacceptable? Emily opened her mouth to respond, but her words faltered. She looked away, her face red with shame. For the first time she appeared vulnerable, stripped of the arrogance and authority she had wielded so carelessly. I'm sorry, she whispered, barely audible. Jamal studied her for a moment, considering her words. He could see the fear and regret in her eyes, the dawning understanding of the consequences she now faced. But he also knew that an apology, however sincere, was not enough to erase the harm she had caused. This isn't just about me, Emily, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. It's about every passenger you've treated this way, every individual who has been subjected to your bias and disrespect. My responsibility is to them, and I cannot allow this behavior to go unchecked. Emily swallowed, her eyes filling with tears as the gravity of her actions finally took hold. She looked down, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her own choices had become too much to bear. Jamal took a step back, signaling that their conversation was over. He glanced at Mark, who nodded in silent understanding, stepping forward to guide Emily away. As they left the galley, Jamal felt a mixture of emotions: satisfaction, disappointment, and a renewed commitment to ensuring that his airline lived up to the values he had fought so hard to establish. He returned to his seat, his mind already turning to the changes he knew he would need to implement. This incident had exposed flaws not only in the behavior of one individual, but in the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchallenged. He would need to address these issues head-on to ensure that every member of his team understood the values of respect and inclusivity. As he settled back into his seat, the other passengers looked at him with a newfound respect, their expressions filled with empathy and support. Some nodded quietly, acknowledging the strength and dignity with which he had handled the situation. Jamal offered them a small, grateful smile, knowing that their silent solidarity was a testament to the importance of the values he held dear. The remainder of the flight passed in a quiet but tense atmosphere. Emily did not return to the cabin, her absence a stark reminder of the consequences she now faced. The passengers, meanwhile, seemed to breathe easier, their unease replaced by a sense of calm. Jamal could feel the shift in the energy around him, a silent recognition that justice had been served. As the plane began its descent, Jamal's thoughts turned to the future. He knew that this incident would be the catalyst for a new chapter in his airline, a renewed commitment to the principles of dignity, respect, and equality. And as the plane touched down, he felt a sense of resolve, a quiet determination to ensure that his company would continue to stand as a beacon of integrity in an industry often plagued by prejudice. For Jamal, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a reaffirmation of his commitment to the values that had guided him through every challenge, every obstacle, and every triumph. And as he stepped off the plane, he knew that this was only the beginning. The plane had just landed, and the passengers were beginning to unbuckle their seatbelts, reaching for bags and stretching after the long flight. Jamal, seated near the back, waited for the cabin to clear before making his way toward the exit. The atmosphere was palpably tense, a hushed buzz filling the air as the passengers exchanged quiet, respectful nods toward him. Many had witnessed Emily's behavior, and although only a few had openly voiced their disapproval, the shared glances and murmurs spoke volumes. As Jamal approached the front of the plane, he noticed Emily standing stiffly near the exit, her face pale and her expression a mixture of regret and fear. Next to her stood Mark and Sarah, the young flight attendant who had shown him kindness throughout the journey. She cast him a small, sympathetic smile as he approached, her eyes conveying a silent apology on behalf of her colleague. The captain, a tall, dignified man with a greying beard, stood waiting for Jamal at the exit. His gaze was one of quiet respect and understanding, a stark contrast to Emily's anxious and defensive posture. He extended his hand to Jamal as he neared, his voice low but sincere. "Mr. Carter," the captain began, his tone respectful, "it has come to my attention that there were issues during this flight. I want to assure you that this is not reflective of our airline's standards. On behalf of the entire crew, I deeply apologize." Jamal shook the captain's hand, nodding slightly. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your words, and I understand that not everyone here is responsible for what occurred." The captain nodded, glancing briefly at Emily, who was doing her best to avoid eye contact. "Please know that we take these matters seriously, Mr. Carter, and we will be conducting a thorough review of everything that happened." "Good," Jamal replied, his tone steady. "I hope this review will lead to changes that ensure this kind of behavior isn't tolerated on future flights." As he spoke, he noticed Emily's face flush with shame. The reality of her actions seemed to have finally sunk in, and her once proud demeanor had deflated. She looked as though she wanted to speak, perhaps to offer an apology, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Her eyes darted between Jamal, the captain, and the other crew members, a silent plea visible in her gaze. But Jamal remained firm, meeting her look with one that communicated both disappointment and resolve. Then, unexpectedly, Jamal turned to address both Emily and the captain. "As the owner of this airline, I want to be absolutely clear about something," he began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "Every passenger on our flights deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. That is not just a policy, it's a core principle of this company, and when that principle is violated, it reflects poorly on all of us." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she seemed on the verge of speaking, but Jamal held up a hand, stopping her. "Emily," he continued, "what you did on this flight was not just a poor decision or a lapse in judgment. It was a breach of the trust that passengers place in us every time they step on one of our planes. It was also a betrayal of the values we, as a company, stand for." A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek, her expression one of regret mixed with fear. Jamal could see the genuine remorse in her eyes, but he knew that her actions had consequences that couldn't simply be erased by an apology. "I'll be reporting this incident to our HR department for a full investigation," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. There will be disciplinary measures, and there will be changes in our training programs to ensure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again. Emily nodded, her shoulders slumping in resignation. She seemed to understand that there was no escaping the repercussions of her actions, and she offered a quiet, shaky, "I'm sorry," that hung heavily in the air. Jamal acknowledged her apology with a slight nod, but his expression remained impassive, his mind already focused on the steps he needed to take to address the systemic issues this incident had brought to light. The captain cleared his throat, stepping forward to address Jamal once more. "Mr. Carter, if there's anything more we can do to make this right, please don't hesitate to let us know. This company owes you that much at the very least." Jamal looked around, taking in the faces of the crew and the few remaining passengers who had gathered near the exit, watching the exchange with quiet intensity. He could see in their expressions a mixture of respect, gratitude, and a shared understanding of the importance of what had just transpired. "Thank you, Captain," he replied, his voice softening slightly. "What matters now is that we learn from this and use it as an opportunity to grow, as individuals and as a company." With that, Jamal turned and stepped off the plane, his heart heavy yet resolute. He knew that this moment would mark a turning point, not just for the airline but for every person involved. The incident would serve as a reminder of the values he had built his company upon, values he was now more determined than ever to uphold. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed that some of the passengers who had witnessed the events on the plane were also filing out, casting him looks of support and respect. One elderly woman who had defended him earlier approached, offering him a small nod. "Thank you for handling that with such grace," she said quietly, her eyes filled with admiration. "It's people like you who make a real difference." Jamal offered her a warm smile. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." As he continued through the terminal, his thoughts drifted to the future. This incident would not be brushed aside or forgotten. He would make certain that every crew member, every employee, understood the importance of treating others with dignity and respect. It was a commitment he made not only to himself, but to every passenger who chose to fly with his airline. And as he walked toward the exit, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would define his legacy, not just as an airline owner, but as a leader who stood by his principles, even in the face of adversity. In the days following the incident, Jamal found himself back at the headquarters of his airline, where the weight of responsibility pressed on him more than ever. The events of the flight had shown him that, despite his best efforts, there were still areas in his company where biases and unprofessional behavior persisted. He was determined to address these flaws head-on, not just to avoid future incidents, but to instill a renewed culture of respect and integrity throughout his organization. The first step was a meeting with his HR team. They gathered in a bright conference room with wide windows overlooking the city, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and anticipation. Jamal could see that they were aware of the incident, and he knew they were waiting to hear his stance on what had happened and how he wanted to proceed. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone calm but firm. "As some of you may know, there was an incident on one of our flights recently that highlighted a serious breach in the values we stand for as a company. It's a reminder that we have work to do to ensure that every member of our team truly understands and embodies our commitment to respect and equality." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. The team members listened intently, their expressions serious. "Effective immediately," he continued, "we will be launching a comprehensive review of our training programs, particularly focusing on inclusivity, cultural sensitivity, and respect in customer service. I want to make sure that every person who wears our uniform understands that they are a representative of not just this airline, but the values we uphold." One of the senior HR managers, a woman named Carla, raised her hand. "Mr. Carter, thank you for addressing this so directly. We've already begun looking into adjustments to the training materials. Would you like to personally oversee any part of the process?" Jamal nodded. "Yes, Carla. I'll be directly involved. I want a clear, concise code of conduct that outlines expectations for our team members' behavior, not just in terms of service quality, but in the way they interact with every single passenger." Carla nodded, taking notes as Jamal continued. "I also want an open forum for our employees to share any issues they encounter, whether it's in their interactions with passengers or within their teams. We need transparency and accountability from the top down." Jamal's words were met with a sense of understanding and purpose among the HR team. They knew that the changes he was calling for would transform the company in fundamental ways, setting a new standard for professionalism and integrity. In the following weeks, Jamal met with various departments, from training and development to operations, overseeing the implementation of new policies aimed at fostering a culture of inclusivity and respect. He made it clear that these changes were not temporary adjustments or a reaction to a single incident. They were a new way forward for the airline, a permanent evolution. The feedback from employees was immediate. Many welcomed the opportunity to receive training that focused not only on technical skills, but on values that resonated with them personally. Employees who had previously felt marginalized or unheard found a renewed sense of pride in being part of an organization that prioritized equality and fairness. Meanwhile, Emily's case was reviewed by the disciplinary committee. After a thorough investigation, she was suspended and required to undergo intensive retraining in both customer service and cultural sensitivity before any consideration of returning to her position. Jamal believed in the importance of second chances, but knew that they had to be earned and that she needed to fully comprehend the impact of her actions. 1 month later, Jamal addressed his employees in a virtual town hall meeting. It was the first time he had spoken publicly about the changes being implemented and the vision he had for the future of the airline. The employees listened closely as he shared his insights from the incident, using it as a catalyst for broader reflection on the company's core principles. Every day, our passengers trust us with their safety, their time, and their comfort, he said, his voice resonant with conviction. And they deserve to be treated with the utmost respect, no matter who they are. This isn't just about providing great service, it's about embodying the values we believe in, values of fairness, dignity, and respect. He looked directly into the camera, his gaze steady. We are an airline that represents everyone. From this moment forward, we will hold ourselves to the highest standards, knowing that every action we take reflects our commitment to these values. The response was overwhelming. Employees, inspired by Jamal's words, flooded the chat with messages of support and appreciation. They were grateful to be part of an organization that didn't just pay lip service to its principles, but acted on them in meaningful ways. As the call ended, Jamal sat back, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. He knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that the work of building a truly inclusive culture was ongoing and required constant vigilance. But he also knew that his company was stronger, more united, and more committed to its mission than ever before. In the weeks and months that followed, the changes at the airline became widely recognized in the industry. Passengers began to notice the difference, with many writing in to commend the exceptional service and respectful treatment they received from the staff. The company's reputation grew, and Jamal saw the positive effects of his leadership reflected not only in passenger satisfaction, but in employee morale as well. One day, as he was leaving his office, Jamal received a letter. It was from Sarah, the young flight attendant who had shown him kindness during the flight. In her letter, she expressed her gratitude for the changes he had implemented, thanking him for being a leader who stood by his principles and inspired others to do the same. Jamal smiled as he read her words, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He had always believed that leadership was about more than profits and growth. It was about making a difference, about standing for something greater than oneself. And in that moment, he knew that despite the challenges, he was exactly where he was meant to be. For Jamal, this was more than just an incident on a flight. It was a testament to the power of integrity, to the belief that real change was possible when one had the courage to stand up for what was right. And as he walked out of his office that evening, he knew that his journey as a leader and the journey of his airline was just beginning.